The year was 1854, and the world was not kind to women who had no one to protect them. In a small countryside village, tucked between rolling hills and muddy farmlands, lived a woman named Eliza Carter. She was not born into wealth or privilege. She was the daughter of a farmer who worked himself to death before she had even reached her 20s. Her mother, too, had been frail and ill, leaving Eliza to learn early that life demanded more endurance than joy. By the time she married her first husband, Thomas, Eliza thought perhaps fate had finally given her a little shelter. Thomas was not a rich man, but he was hard-working. He owned a small piece of land, a rickety cottage, and one cow that gave milk for their daily bread. For Eliza, that was enough. For the first time, she thought she had found stability. She could wake up each morning to the sound of the cow mooing, to the smell of fresh bread baking in her small clay oven, and to the warm, steady presence of a man who promised to stand beside her. But fate, as it often does, had other plans. That winter, fever swept through the village. One by one, families buried their sons, daughters, and even infants. It was the kind of fever that came quietly but burned mercilessly. Thomas caught it in early January. At first, he dismissed it as a cold, still trying to work in the fields even as sweat poured from his body. But within days, he could no longer stand. His strong body, the one Eliza had leaned on, shrank into weakness. His voice, once deep and steady, trembled with pain. Eliza nursed him with everything she had. She used herbs, cloth soaked in cold water, and whispered prayers late into the night. She did not sleep, did not eat, only sat by his side, waiting for his labored breathing to grow calm. But within 2 weeks Thomas was gone, his body laid into the cold earth, while Eliza stood shivering beside the grave. She was now a widow. In 1854, widowhood was not just grief, it was a sentence. Society treated a widow as someone broken, tainted by misfortune, and no longer useful. To be without a husband was to be without identity. When Eliza returned to her cottage after the burial, she already knew nothing would be the same. The first blow came swiftly. The land Thomas had worked on was not truly his. It belonged to a landlord who had allowed him to farm it in exchange for a share of the harvest. Without Thomas, Eliza had no rights to keep it. The landlord came within weeks, telling her to pack what little she owned. The cow was taken, the field reassigned, and she was left standing with only a small wooden chest, her clothes, and a single iron cooking pot that had belonged to her mother. The second blow came from society itself. In her village, a widow was no longer treated with respect. Women whispered when Eliza walked by. Some claimed she was cursed, that Thomas had died because of her bad luck. Men avoided her gaze, for a widow was considered dangerous, an omen that could bring ruin to another man's household. Even children, repeating the words of their parents, mocked her in the streets. But the hardest blow of all was hunger. Without land, without animals, without money, Eliza had no way to feed herself. The little coins she had saved from selling eggs and milk were quickly spent. The bread she baked grew smaller each day, until there was nothing left to bake at all. She ate roots, weeds, and anything she could find by the riverbank. At night, she would boil water in her mother's iron pot just to drink something warm and trick her body into thinking it had been fed. Still she endured. Every morning, she rose before dawn, walking into the woods to gather sticks to sell for firewood. But the pay was almost nothing. Families would look at her bundle and hand her a single coin, sometimes not even that. Yet she carried on, because giving up meant dying. It was during these nights of hunger, sitting beside her iron pot, that Eliza began to see the truth society would not save her. The whispers of women, the judgment of men, the silence of the church, all of it told her that as a widow she was invisible. If she wanted to live, she would have to find her own way, no matter how the world judged her. Grief had turned into hunger, and hunger turned into determination. She remembered her mother's words from long ago. When the world takes everything from you, Eliza, hold on to one thing, the will to survive. And so, with that iron pot and the fire of survival in her heart, Eliza decided she would not die a forgotten widow. If society demanded she remarry for survival, then she would. If men came and went like shadows, she would endure it. If people mocked her, she would let them talk. She would do whatever it took, because her struggle had already taught her one lesson: life does not favor the weak, but it bows to the relentless. This was the beginning of Eliza's long, difficult journey. The first chapter of a story that would shock her village, echo through generations, and prove that even the most broken can find strength in the ashes of loss. The weeks after Thomas's death were a blur for Eliza Carter. Grief hung heavy in her heart, but hunger pressed heavier on her stomach. She had no land, no family, and no one to call her own. By spring, her savings were gone, and her clothes had begun to fray. The once strong woman who laughed while baking bread now looked like a shadow, thin, weary, but not broken. In those days, a widow's options were cruelly limited. Work for women was nearly non-existent. There were no factories in her small countryside village, no schools willing to pay for teaching, no noble households offering steady employment. A widow might sew, wash clothes, or beg, but none of these were enough to survive on, and begging was worse than hunger, for it meant surrendering dignity, the only thing Eliza still had. Whispers followed her wherever she went. Some men looked at her with pity, others with desire, but none with respect. The village women, bound by superstition, avoided her, saying her shadow alone could bring misfortune. She was in their eyes a cursed woman, yet in the quiet of her nights, when she boiled water in her iron pot just to silence her stomach, she thought not of curses but of survival. And that was when the idea first took root: marriage. Eliza hated the thought at first. Her heart still carried the memory of Thomas, the man who had once promised her safety, the man she had buried with her own trembling hands. To marry again so soon felt like betrayal, yet hunger argued louder than love. Hunger is a teacher more persuasive than grief. By midsummer, a man named Richard Hale approached her. He was older than Thomas, with gray at his temples and a reputation for being stern but fair. He had heard of her struggle and, like others in the village, believed a woman could not survive without a man. His offer was simple: marriage. In exchange, Eliza would have food, a roof, and protection. But there would be no romance, no tenderness. It was a transaction, his need for a housekeeper and her need for survival. Eliza spent sleepless nights thinking. Pride told her not to bow. Fear told her she would starve if she refused. At dawn one morning, after another night of drinking nothing but boiled water, she looked at her iron pot and whispered, "Mother, forgive me. Thomas, forgive me. I must live." And so she agreed. The wedding was quiet, almost shameful. No celebrations, no music, no joy. Only a small gathering with villagers whispering behind their hands. Some pitied her, others mocked her, saying she was quick to replace her husband. But Eliza ignored them. She had learned already that the world's opinions did not fill an empty stomach. Her life with Richard was not easy. He was not cruel, but neither was he kind. To him, Eliza was useful, not beloved. She cooked, she cleaned, she tended to the little farm he owned. At night she lay beside him but felt as though she was still alone. Still she endured. She told herself she had done what she must. But fate once again was unmerciful. That autumn, Richard fell ill. The same fever that had claimed Thomas returned, and within weeks it claimed Richard too. Once again, Eliza found herself at a graveside, watching another husband lowered into the earth. The whispers grew louder now. Villagers said she carried death in her shadow. 2 husbands in less than a year. It was too much coincidence for their superstitious minds. Yet beneath the gossip, Eliza's own fear deepened. She was once again alone, once again with nothing but her iron pot, once again the widow no one wanted near. But this time, something had changed within her. The shame of remarriage had vanished. The fear of society's judgment had grown weaker. She had done it once, and she realized she could do it again. Her decision was no longer about love or companionship. It was about survival. And survival, she now understood, demanded sacrifice after sacrifice. If marriage was the only path to food and shelter, then marriage she would choose, again and again if necessary. And so Eliza made a vow to herself. She would not let hunger kill her. She would not let superstition bury her alive. She would marry again as many times as it took, until her body was too tired to move or her spirit too stubborn to break. It was a vow born not of weakness but of strength. Society called her cursed, but in truth she was courageous. Where other widows gave up, Eliza fought. Where others hid in shame, she stood tall, willing to risk her reputation for the simple, stubborn right to live. Her second husband's death was not the end. It was the beginning of a cycle that would shock the village and stain her name in whispers. But to Eliza, each choice was clear. She would not starve. She would not beg. She would endure, no matter how many times fate tried to break her. And so began the tale of the widow who married 7 men in 1 year, who cooked for them all in the same pot, and who turned her shame into survival. By the end of 1854, Eliza Carter had buried 2 husbands. In the eyes of the villagers, this was proof enough that she was cursed. But in Eliza's eyes, it was proof of something else. That survival came only to those who dared to keep living, no matter the whispers. Her second husband, Richard Hale, had provided her shelter for only a season before death snatched him away. Once again, she stood alone with her mother's iron pot, the only possession that had stayed constant through her shifting fortunes. But this time, she no longer carried the same shame she had felt after Thomas's death. Hunger had stripped her of pride, and necessity had hardened her heart. Eliza now understood marriage differently. To her, it was not about companionship nor even about protection. It was simply a transaction of survival. A husband meant food, a roof, a place to exist without begging. Love was a luxury she could no longer afford. By winter, a farmer named Samuel Boyd asked for her hand. He was lonely, with no family left, and saw in Eliza a woman who could cook, clean, and share his bed. To him, she was not cursed, she was useful. To Eliza, Samuel was another chance to survive the winter. Their marriage lasted less than 2 months. Samuel fell from his horse one icy morning, breaking his neck. Eliza buried yet another man, the whispers growing louder. Villagers muttered that wherever she went, death followed. Still, she endured. Soon after, a widower named John Taylor came to her. He was desperate. He had children who needed a caretaker. Eliza accepted, not out of love, but because children meant food on the table and shelter in a house that could not turn her away. She cooked meals in her iron pot, the same pot she had used for Thomas, Richard, and Samuel. But John, worn down by grief and overwork, caught the same fever that had haunted the village all year. Within weeks, Eliza once again found herself a widow. She did not weep this time. Her tears had dried with Thomas. Instead, she simply scrubbed her pot clean and prepared herself for what must come next. The villagers began to mock her openly. Some called her a black widow, others refused to stand near her. But not every man believed in curses. A drifter named Henry Clark offered marriage. He had no land, no family, nothing but his strength, and he thought Eliza could cook and mend his clothes while he sought work. Eliza agreed, for strength and youth meant at least some hope of survival. But Henry's temper was cruel. He beat her when he drank, cursed her when she cooked too little, and left her alone for days while chasing wages that never came. When he finally picked a fight in a tavern, it ended with a knife to his chest. Eliza did not mourn him. She simply cleaned her iron pot, packed her few belongings, and moved on. By now, even those who mocked her understood one thing: Eliza would not give up. If one man died, she would marry another. If another left her hungry, she would search again. She was relentless. Her 6th husband was Peter Collins, a kind man though weak in body. He worked as a woodcutter, but often came home too tired to eat. Eliza cooked for him in her pot, fed him broth, and tried to nurse his fragile health. But Peter's lungs were already failing. Within a season, he too was gone. The villagers shook their heads. She cooked them all in the same pot, they said, laughing bitterly. Every man who eats from her pot ends in the grave. Eliza ignored them. She scrubbed her pot clean, just as she always did. By the time spring returned, Eliza had married 6 times and buried 6 husbands. Most women would have surrendered by now, given into despair, starvation, or the weight of shame. But not Eliza. She had survived each death, each whisper, each empty night. And when a mill worker named Edward Burns asked for her hand, she agreed without hesitation. Edward was young, strong, and hopeful. He saw Eliza not as cursed, but as resilient. "You have endured more than anyone," he told her once. "That is not a curse, it is strength." His words warmed her in a way she had not felt in years. For the first time since Thomas, she allowed herself to believe that perhaps fate might finally give her rest. But fate was merciless. An accident at the mill crushed Edward beneath a heavy wheel. Eliza buried her seventh husband with steady hands and dry eyes. She no longer cried, no longer trembled. She had become steel. By the end of that year, Eliza had married 7 men and buried them all. The villagers no longer pitied her, they feared her. Some crossed the street to avoid her shadow. Others mocked her openly, saying she carried death in her cooking pot. Children sang cruel rhymes about her. Yet Eliza herself had changed. She no longer cared about their whispers. She no longer felt shame when she carried water from the well or walked through the marketplace. She had done what few could do. She had survived. The iron pot, blackened from fire and worn from years of use, had fed each of her husbands. The villagers joked that she cooked them all in the same pot. But for Eliza, the pot was not a curse. It was her anchor. It had boiled water when she had nothing else. It had cooked meals for every man who came into her life. It had kept her alive through hunger and ridicule. 7 husbands in 1 year, 7 graves dug, 7 journeys of loss. And yet she still stood. By the time Eliza Carter had buried her 7th husband, the whispers in the village had grown into cruel laughter. People no longer spoke of her with pity. They spoke of her as if she were a dark tale to frighten children. She cooked them all in the same pot, they said, smirking as she passed by. That phrase clung to her name like a brand. It followed her wherever she went, at the marketplace, at the well, on the dirt roads leading through the fields. The villagers turned her story into entertainment, ignoring the truth of her suffering. They saw only the number of graves, not the strength it had taken to keep rising after each loss. But for Eliza, the pot was not a joke. It was the only thing that had never abandoned her. It was heavy iron and blackened with age. Her mother had given it to her when she first married Thomas. As long as you can boil water, her mother had told her, you will never starve. At the time, Eliza thought little of the gift, but as life stripped her of husband after husband, land after land, and hope after hope, that pot remained the one faithful companion in her lonely journey. She had cooked bread in it for Thomas. She had boiled herbs in it for Richard when the fever consumed him. She had made stews in it for Samuel, porridge for John's children, and broth for Peter when his lungs weakened. For Henry, she cooked meat on the rare nights he came home with something to eat. For Edward, she prepared hearty meals, believing for a moment that strength and youth might keep death away. Each man was different, each marriage brief, but the pot was always the same. It was not cursed, as the villagers claimed. It was constant. It was her proof that no matter how many times life broke her, she still rose to cook another meal, to live another day. The cruel irony of life in 1855 was that people feared what they did not understand. Instead of admiring Eliza's resilience, they branded her with superstition. They whispered that any man who ate from her pot would soon meet the grave. Some even claimed she poisoned her husbands, though she had no reason and nothing to gain from such a crime. Women pulled their children away when she walked past. Men laughed in taverns, saying, "Best not eat her stew, unless you've dug your grave already." But Eliza never argued with them. She had learned long ago that words did not fill an empty stomach. Let them mock, let them laugh. Their cruelty did not feed her, nor did it break her. She returned to her cottage each night, lit her fire, and placed her pot over the flames. Alone, but alive, in time, Eliza began to see the pot not only as a tool for survival, but as a metaphor for her own life. The iron had endured countless fires, yet it had not cracked. It was scarred, darkened, and heavy, but still strong, just like her. When she looked into its black surface, she saw her reflection tired, worn, but unbroken. The pot had cooked for the living and for the dying. It had served in moments of hope and in nights of despair. It had witnessed her tears, her prayers, her anger, and her silence. Every meal she made in it, no matter how small, was a declaration, "I am still here." What the villagers mocked as a curse, Eliza began to embrace as her strength. She stopped hiding when people whispered. She carried her pot proudly in the marketplace, trading bread and stews for coins or scraps of cloth. Children who once mocked her began to sneak near her cottage, drawn by the smell of food. Sometimes, when she had enough, she shared bowls of soup with them. Their laughter softened her bitterness. Slowly, her story shifted. The very pot they mocked as a death sentence became a lifeline for others. When harsh winters struck and poor families struggled, Eliza cooked what little she had and offered it to the hungry. She never turned a child away. Mothers, ashamed but desperate, sent their little ones to her, and she fed them from the same pot the villagers had cursed. And so, the pot became more than survival. It became her redemption. Years passed, and though Eliza never remarried, she never starved. She grew older, her hair turning gray, her body thin but steady. The villagers' whispers faded as newer scandals replaced her story, but some remembered her not as cursed, but as resilient. For the children she once fed, the pot was not a symbol of death. It was a symbol of kindness. They grew up remembering the widow who, despite her own losses, gave them warmth and food when no one else would. Eliza herself saw the pot as her greatest teacher. It reminded her daily that life is not about what breaks you, but about what you carry through the fire. Just as iron hardens when placed in flame, so too had she. By the time of her death, Eliza had little to leave behind. She had no wealth, no land, and no descendants. But she left her pot, the same iron vessel that had boiled water on nights of hunger, cooked meals for 7 husbands, and fed countless children stood as her legacy. To the villagers it became a strange sort of relic. To some it was still cursed, but to others, those who knew her story, it was a reminder of what it meant to endure. The widow who cooked them all in the same pot was not cursed at all. She was strong, relentless, and unbroken. Her pot was not the mark of death, it was the symbol of survival. By 1856, Eliza Carter was no longer the grieving young widow the village had first pitied. She was now a hardened woman in her 30s, thin from years of hunger, her hands calloused from work, her eyes sharp with resilience. She had buried 7 husbands, endured mockery, and carried the weight of every cruel whisper that followed her through the streets. But something inside her had changed. She no longer flinched when people called her cursed. She no longer trembled at the thought of loneliness. Instead, she had grown indifferent to the world's judgment, and that indifference became her strength. The winter of 1856 was one of the harshest in memory. Snow blanketed the countryside, freezing the fields and silencing the rivers. Even the wealthier families struggled to keep food on their tables. For the poor, it was a season of despair. Eliza, as always, had little. Her iron pot simmered with thin soups made from roots, wild herbs, and whatever scraps she could trade. She wrapped herself in patched shawls, her breath visible in the bitter air inside her tiny cottage. One evening, as the wind howled outside and she sat beside her fire, she heard a knock at her door. Opening it, she found 2 children, thin, trembling, their lips blue from cold. They were the children of John Taylor, her 4th husband, who had died years before. Their stepmother had turned them out, unable or unwilling to feed more mouths. "Miss Eliza," the eldest whispered, "please, do you have anything to eat?" Eliza stared at them, her heart twisting. She herself had so little. Yet she looked at her pot simmering on the fire and saw enough for 3 bowls, if she stretched it. She let them in, wrapped them in blankets, and shared what she had. That night she went to bed hungry so they would not. Word spread quickly. More children appeared at her door in the weeks that followed. Orphans, beggars, and little ones whose parents could not feed them. At first Eliza resisted, fearing she would not survive if she gave too much. But each time she turned a child away, her conscience burned. One night she whispered to herself, "If I could feed 7 men, I can feed a few hungry children." And so she began cooking for them. The same pot that had once mocked her now bubbled with soups and stews made from whatever she could gather. Sometimes it was only boiled water with herbs. Sometimes a kind soul left her bread or a turnip at the door. She stretched every ingredient as far as it would go, filling small wooden bowls and placing them into little hands. The villagers, curious and suspicious, watched as the cursed widow became the woman the hungry children flocked to. At first they mocked her again. "No, she cooks children in her pot." But as the weeks passed, the laughter dimmed. They saw the thin faces of their own sons and daughters returning from Eliza's cottage with warmth in their eyes and food in their bellies. The woman they had branded as a curse had become something else entirely. One by one, the villagers began to soften. A farmer's wife, once cruel with her whispers, sent Eliza a sack of potatoes. A blacksmith left firewood by her door. A baker slipped her extra loaves that would have otherwise gone stale. None admitted it openly, but they were beginning to see Eliza differently. No longer just the widow who had cooked 7 husbands in one pot. She was becoming the widow who fed the village's hungry children. For the first time in years, Eliza felt something stir within her chest that was not grief or hunger. It was purpose. The pot itself seemed to take on new meaning. Once, it had been a symbol of loss, a cruel reminder of how every man who ate from it had ended in the grave. But now, it was a vessel of compassion. Each night when Eliza placed it over the fire, she did so with intention. Not for herself, not for a husband, but for the little mouths that would gather at her door. She no longer scrubbed it with sorrow, but with pride. The villagers might never call her blessed, but she knew in her heart that her pot was no curse. It was a blessing disguised in iron. For Eliza, this change was more than survival. It was the moment her story shifted from endurance to meaning. She no longer lived just to outlast hunger and loneliness. She lived to give. In feeding the children, she discovered a strange truth. Though she had no children of her own, she had become a mother to many. The little ones called her Aunt Eliza and brought her flowers in spring. They laughed in her cottage, filling it with a warmth she had not felt since Thomas was alive. She had been mocked for marrying 7 men. She had been pitied for burying them all. But now she was respected, even if quietly, for turning her sorrow into strength, her curse into kindness. The widow who had once been a scandal was now a quiet legend, not because she had survived 7 husbands, but because she had taken her broken life and made it useful to others. The true turning point was not in the number of men she had married or buried. It was in the night she looked at 2 hungry children and chose to share her last bowl of soup. From that moment forward, Eliza Carter was no longer defined by her losses. She was defined by what she gave. The same pot that had once been the village's cruel joke had become the center of her legacy. Eliza Carter lived quietly through the years that followed, her name still whispered but now in softer tones. The scandal of her 7 marriages slowly faded as time pushed forward, but the memory of the widow with the iron pot remained. By the late 1860s, Eliza was no longer the young woman who had buried her husbands in rapid succession. Her hair had gone silver, her back had bent, and her once calloused hands had grown frail. Yet, she still lived in the same small cottage, with the same iron pot hanging above her hearth. It had carried her through decades of storms, feeding not only herself but also the hungry children who had once gathered around her fire. She never remarried after Edward's death. 7 graves were enough for one lifetime. Instead, she devoted herself quietly to the role fate had carved for her, caretaker of the forgotten. Children who once came to her door in ragged clothes eventually grew into adults. Some became farmers, some apprentices, some wives and mothers themselves. And though life scattered them in different directions, many remembered where they had found food on cold winter nights. When they passed her cottage, they no longer mocked her. Instead, they greeted her with respect. "Good evening, Aunt Eliza," they would say, tipping their hats or offering her a loaf of bread. She would smile, her tired eyes softening, and thank them with the same gentleness she had shown when they were small. Though she had no children of her own, Eliza had raised a village in her own way. Her motherhood was not written in bloodlines but in kindness. As Eliza aged, her iron pot became a kind of relic in the village. It had outlived 7 husbands, survived countless winters, and never once cracked under fire. Children, now grown, spoke of it with a mixture of awe and reverence. "That pot saved me when I was a boy," one farmer told his son. "She made soup for me in that very pot when my parents had nothing." A woman shared with her daughter. The same pot that had once been ridiculed, mocked as cursed, a grave maker of men, was now remembered as a vessel of generosity. Eliza herself saw it as the truest mirror of her life. Blackened, battered, and scarred, but unbreakable, in her final years Eliza grew weaker. She no longer gathered firewood herself. Neighbors began leaving small bundles at her door. She no longer fetched water from the well. Children she had once fed now filled her buckets. Slowly, the village that had once scorned her began to care for her, returning the kindness she had quietly sown. One winter evening, as snow fell heavy against her cottage windows, Eliza sat before her fire with her iron pot simmering one last thin stew. She ate slowly, savoring not the taste but the warmth. She knew her time was nearing its end. Looking at the pot, she whispered softly, "You and I, we survived it all." When Eliza passed away in her sleep that night, she left behind no wealth, no land, no children to carry her name. She left only her story and her pot. When word spread of her death, the villagers gathered. Old men who had once mocked her stood silently. Women who had once whispered superstitions bowed their heads. The children she had fed, now adults, came in numbers. They brought flowers, bread, and tears of gratitude. At her burial, one of them spoke. She was not cursed. She was blessed with strength greater than any of us understood. She turned her suffering into kindness, and because of her, many of us are alive today. Her iron pot was placed beside her grave, not as a curse but as a symbol of her resilience. The same vessel that had fed 7 husbands and countless children was now her monument. Eliza Carter's life taught the village, and anyone who remembered her, a lesson too powerful to be ignored. Suffering can be transformed into strength, and ridicule into legacy. She had every reason to give up. Society mocked her, superstition branded her, and fate struck her down again and again. Yet she refused to surrender. Each time she lost, she began again. Each time she starved, she found a way to eat. Each time the world told her she was cursed, she turned her curse into compassion. Her life was proof that survival itself is a form of courage. The villagers once said she cooked them all in the same pot, mocking her tragedy. But as years passed, those words took on new meaning. She had cooked them all in the same pot. Her husbands, the children of the village, even herself. That pot was not a grave. It was the vessel of life. The true lesson of Eliza's story was not about death, but about endurance. It was not about 7 husbands lost, but about the strength of one woman who refused to be broken. She showed that you cannot choose what life takes from you, but you can choose what you give back. Decades later, long after her cottage had fallen to ruin, the story of Eliza Carter was still told in the village. Mothers spoke of her to their children as an example of resilience. Men spoke of her as a warning against judging too quickly. And the children she had fed grew old themselves, always remembering the widow who shared what little she had. Eliza Carter's life was not easy, not glamorous, not celebrated in her time, but it was meaningful, and that, perhaps, is the greatest lesson of all. A life need not be long wealthy or admired to be powerful. It need only endure with dignity, and in doing so, it can leave behind a legacy that whispers long after death.